This is a production of Cornell University.
Great. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about one aspect of my work, thinking about agriculture within the Earth system and the interactions that it can have with climate. So my research really broadly focuses on thinking about how terrestrial ecosystems interact within our climate system, meaning how they respond to climate change, how they contribute to climate change, and really how humans have changed those interactions. And so today I'll be thinking about one specific aspect of this, agricultural management, but I just want to emphasize how important plants are within this climate system. And I'll do that by starting to look at this carbon dioxide concentration curve, the Keeling curve, which I'm sure that you are all familiar with. Just my pointer work, yes. So as you'll see from this curve, and you all likely know, concentrations of carbon dioxide are increasing through time, and that increase is caused in large part by human activities. But what I want to draw your attention to is this annual cycle. So I'll blow this up here, and the reason that I want you to pay attention to this annual cycle is because it's driven by terrestrial productivity, specifically in the northern hemisphere where there's more land mass. And so every year, carbon dioxide, when plants start to grow in the summer, in the spring and summer, they take up carbon dioxide, and it's measurable from these large scale measurements. We see how much carbon dioxide is being drawn down by plants every year. And so while a single leaf might seem small, we have, when we globally aggregate plants, if you look at the land surface, a lot of it is green. And so when we globally aggregate plants, they can have a really large measurable influence on climate processes. There we go. And so when we change the land surface, for example, for agriculture, we are changing how that land surface functions, both how it looks, which is really important for biogeophysical or like energy and water fluxes, and then also biogeochemical fluxes, things like carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling. So we're really changing how the land looks, how it functions within our Earth system by managing our land. And so we use a suite of tools to try and understand these processes. And these are all tools that I use in my work. So this includes empirical data collection. This is a manipulative warming experiment at the soy face site, environmental and ecological theory, and also Earth system models. And using this suite of tools enables a lot of really exciting science, including generating new hypotheses, measuring and scaling ecological processes. So you can scale from your field site to regional or global scales using models, understanding complex interactions that are difficult to disentangle in measurements and systems. Also determining the impact of human decisions. We can use models to understand how those decisions might change our ecosystems, our climate, without actually doing a large scale experiment on our climate system. And last, to understand the future of our ecosystems. And this is just a list that I could think of. There's probably additional exciting things that you can think of, but these are ways that I like to use this model. I'm gonna try and move this mouse out of the way. And I wanna take a quick aside. This is a cartoon that I drafted with Emily Kiker-Snowman. We co-led a paper thinking about putting ecology into models. The reason that I want to highlight this is because a lot of times when we collect observations, we just kind of think that they can be stuffed in models. And when modelers are working on models, they just think, why aren't you giving me the observations that I need? I just want this data to put into the model. But really what we need is an integration of these processes. And so we need to think and understand across these two seemingly disparate fields. They're not actually disparate, but they can seem disparate. And so we really need to think about how to better integrate these processes. And I feel like I felt a little bit like Dorothy here, where I was stuffing new processes into models, and I would write my papers at the end of my fieldwork saying, this process should be incorporated in a global scale model because it's important for climate. And I wanted to actually spend a little bit of time figuring that out. And so that's why I ended up at NCAR working with models, trying to figure out what the climate impact was of some of these terrestrial processes. So that's just kind of an aside about why I tried to use that integration or that suite of tools that I use. And so the model that I use, and I'm going to focus mostly or almost entirely, I guess, on model simulations today. So I use the community Earth system model. And as Ying said, this is one of the large global scale Earth system models. It contains all of the different components of the Earth system, or many of the components of the Earth system. So it contains the atmosphere, the land ice, the land, ocean, and sea ice, and they're all connected through a coupler. So that's what that little ball is in the middle. The thing I like about this diagram is it's actually the little bubbles are scaled by the number of lines of code, the size of the bubble. So you can see the atmosphere has the most lines of code. The land model has the second most lines of code. There's over 2 million lines of code in this model. It's a really large model. It's used by the international community to understand climate change. It's probably the most widely used Earth system model that we have. And so this is developed and maintained by NCAR, and it's the model that I will use throughout my work today. And so like I said, it contains all the different components of the Earth system, including the land. And most of the changes that I'm going to make and that we're going to look at today will focus on the land model. So I want to highlight really quickly the land model that is the land component of this Earth system model is the community land model, which we call CLM. So I will be using CLM. CLM includes a suite of ecological processes. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to highlight that these are broadly categorized as surface energy fluxes, hydrology, and biogeochemical cycles. Today, I will focus mostly on surface energy fluxes and biogeochemical cycles. I don't do as much work with hydrology, but there is a lot of hydrology included in these models, if you're interested. And most of the work that I will present is going to couple just the land and the atmosphere components of this model. So you're going to connect the land, perturb the land, see how it changes the atmosphere and atmospheric processes. So that's kind of the broad scale overview. The topics that I will cover today will start with thinking about cover crops and can cover crop management change air temperature. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the crop model that we use in the community land model and how agricultural management has changed global crop yields. Then I'll end with thinking about how agriculture changes seasonal patterns of carbon dioxide fluxes. So we start with cover crops. I have a suite of collaborators for each of these projects, all of whom have been instrumental in helping to guide and develop these projects. And so I just want to highlight them as well. I'm guessing that many of you know what cover crops are, but just in case you don't, cover crops are crops that are planted during the not normal cash crop growing season. And so you can see there are cover crops here on the left, but not here on the right. And so this is an experiment that was comparing cover crops to bare ground. Cover crops provide a lot of localized benefits, and so they're widely used for or maybe not widely used, but they are used for these localized benefits, and they include things like weed and pathogen suppression, reducing erosion, runoff, nitrogen leaching, improving soil processes in general, including infiltration, nutrient cycling, and there's a whole suite of benefits that I'm not including here, but are very beneficial. And so I wanted to know, how do cover crops impact climate? We think a lot about changing soil carbon related to agriculture, and cover crops we thought about in one of those capacities, and also maintaining soil health. And so I started to think about what are the potential cover crop climate feedbacks. So on the biogeochemical side, we have carbon going into the system, but also carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide being released from the ecosystems, and soil carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of active research actually trying to understand all of these different processes on the biogeochemical side. On the biogeophysical side, these are more related to energy fluxes. And so we can think about cover crops as affecting surface roughness a little bit, also albedo, so the reflectivity of the surface, and then soil evaporation and transpiration, which collectively call evapotranspiration. And so less is known about these biogeophysical impacts of cover crops. And so I'm going to focus today on only looking at these biogeophysical impacts. And I'm going to ignore the biogeochemical impacts, even though they are extremely important. I'm just not going to probe that today. So what I would expect when you plant cover crops, so when you go from a bare ground surface to a vegetated surface, you might get some increase in roughness and some increase in evapotranspiration and a decrease in albedo, likely. It'll be less reflective. So surface roughness can help cool the air, soil or evapotranspiration, so soil evaporation and plant transpiration can also help to cool the air through that evaporative cooling flux, latent heat flux. And albedo, if we have less reflectivity, we might increase temperature. So the direction of the impact of each of the individual terms is opposite to its impact on temperature. And so the arrows are showing you the direction that the impact of surface roughness, evapotranspiration, or albedo will have, and then the boxes around them are showing you warming or cooling impact of that. So I use this Earth system model to run a very idealized scenario. So this is, I'm not saying that this is realistic at all, but this is one way that we can use a model is to probe, do cover crops have an impact on climate? And so what I did is I planted cover crops in all crop regions throughout North America with the goal of determining the impact on wintertime temperatures when cover crops are planted compared to bare ground, so compared to no cover crops. And so assume that all crop area is now covered in cover crops for this experiment. And to run this experiment, like I showed earlier, I'm connecting the land model with the atmosphere model to understand how this change in the land surface is impacting the atmosphere. And what I found is that there is significant winter warming in snow-covered regions. So cover crops may increase these winter temperatures in snowy regions. This is up to a 3 or 3.5 degree increase in some regions. The stippling shows you this statistical significance. So that's where there's a statistically significant increase in temperature. This is equivalent to about a 5.5 to 6 degree increase in winter temperature. 5.5 to 6 degree Fahrenheit increase in wintertime temperatures. So it is a definitely a decent amount of warming. But also that's because, and so part of the reason why there is this increase is because cover crops are changing the albedo of the ecosystem. So when we have bare ground and it snows, you see the snow. But if you have cover crops planted, you see a lot more of the crops sticking up above the snow. And so that's what's changing the albedo. You can see how much brighter this bare ground is compared to this region with the cover crops. So that's what's driving that temperature increase. And what I found is when you decrease the height, and this is also true if you make the cover crops less leafy. So maybe you plant them less densely, you just have sparser cover crops, you minimize that winter warming. And so while we see a trend towards warming, I guess you can't see the bottom axis because of the zoom bar, but this is it's the same axis, temperature axis as before. But what you see is that while there's a trend towards warming, you are minimizing that warming. There's no statistically significant warming. And so to me, what this says is that if we're going to plant cover crops, which, you know, we should still consider cover crops because of all their benefits, both on the carbon sequestration potential side and also the soil health side. But if we plant cover crops, we might want to consider planting shorter cover crops or growing or mowing or grazing them when we do plant them so that they are shorter than the snowpack in these snow-covered regions. So just a quick summary of this section of the talk, cover crops may increase winter temperature. That's the impact is primarily in snowy regions where that effect of albedo dominates. And so it's the importance of albedo that is really causing that increase. But we have the potential to minimize that warming with shorter cover crops, or like I said, less leafy cover crops is the other experiment that we did where we saw a decrease in that winter temperature warming. So this is a very idealized scenario. It helps us to understand how we can maybe manage our cover crops to mitigate any potential warming consequences. But also, we have no experiments to evaluate this against. I don't know of any experiments that have actually measured energy fluxes in cover crop ecosystems. A lot of the research that I am aware of has focused primarily on the soil health effects and the carbon effects rather, and some of the hydrology impacts as well, but not as much the energy fluxes. And so it would be really great to see maybe a flux tower in a cover crop field so that we can better understand, or some other way to think about measuring some of these energy fluxes so that we can better understand if these model simulations are showing us the actual impact of cover crops on wintertime temperatures. Okay, so like I said, with agricultural management, we are changing the way the land surface looks and the way that it functions. And so that's, this experiment, this cover crop experiment is just highlighting one example of that. And so next I want to dive into thinking about agricultural management a little bit more in depth. And how, so the question that I will ask is how agricultural management has changed global crop yields. But in doing so, I will also explain a little bit about how agriculture is represented in the community land model. So I'm going to dive in and just focus on land only impacts right now. And thinking about only having the land capacity. I guess it's a little loud out there. Yeah, sorry about that. You can all hear me still? Yeah, okay. So the way that we represent crops in the community land model, I should highlight that this model in particular is based on the agro-IBIS model. That's what we use currently. We are doing some new development to incorporate the APSIM model, which is a little bit more flexible and will allow us to do a little bit more. The one thing that I will highlight is that the way the crop model that we have in the Earth system model, it is an Earth system model first. And so I don't expect this to be as detail oriented or as great of a model as an agronomic model, for example, that is looking in more detail. But this is a really useful model, like I was just showing you, to try and understand climate impacts of agriculture and how agriculture fits within our Earth system. And that's something that we often can't do in agronomic models. So we represent currently several different crop types. We have temperate and tropical varieties of corn and soy. So we grow crops in both temperate and tropical regions. We also have sugarcane, cotton, rice. We have miscanthus and switchgrass, two of our bioenergy crops. Those are currently, even though we have ways to simulate them, they're currently not included on our surface data set. And so we need to make some modifications to add the regions where these crops are growing in order to use them more effectively in the model. And then we also have a representation of wheat. We actually have two types of wheat that we represent, winter wheat and spring wheat, but we can't easily distinguish where winter wheat is growing versus where spring wheat is growing. And so it makes it hard to use both of those. And so for wheat, what we're doing right now is we're currently simulating all wheat areas as spring wheat, even though that is not, we know that that's not accurate. We just don't have the capability to disentangle where winter wheat versus spring wheat is growing at this time. And these are global data sets, I should say. So it's not, we can distinguish potentially more at the regional scale, but we don't have global scale data sets to help us distinguish. So I want to highlight also that agriculture in this model is globally distributed. And so this is, I should also say that this is a really unique capability in an Earth system model. The community Earth system model is the only model that includes a comprehensive representation of agriculture. And the reason that I thought of that here is because most of the time when Earth system models do include agriculture, which they do occasionally, they only include it in temperate regions. So usually it's, they'll have some agriculture in North America, in Europe, and in parts of Asia, but they don't include it globally, which makes it really hard to understand the impact that agriculture has. And additionally, in the community land model, we have global crop area changing through time. And again, this is a unique feature within an Earth system model because most Earth system models do not include the temporal change in distributions of crops. They can include crops for present day. There's only one other model that has global distributions of crops, and it's only for present day. So these aren't used in the climate simulations that we're trying to use to understand our Earth system and how climate change is happening, except for in CESM. So CESM is the only model that includes this kind of comprehensive representation of agriculture and agricultural management. So globally distributed and time varying, which is important for understanding the impacts that crops have had over time. The way that phenology is currently represented, as I said, this is based on the agro-IBIS model. There's 4 triggers. There's a planting trigger, there's a leaf emergence trigger, a grain fill trigger, and a harvest trigger. And these phenological phases are all triggered by temperature. So like I said, forthcoming developments will allow for more realistic phenology, including triggers that are based on moisture stress and other types of stressors. We do include 2 types of management currently. We have fertilization and irrigation. Fertilization, we apply manure. It's 2 grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. It's globally constant in all agriculture areas. And then chemical fertilizer, this is prescribed by crop type, by year, and by country. So this does change through space and through time. Irrigation, we have a few different application methods and a few different water sources. I'm really sorry that the Zoom is cutting off the bottom of the slide because you're missing some of the information. But the application methods are the drip irrigation, which is actually our default. And then there's also sprinkler irrigation, and flood irrigation is under development. There's a paper that's just been submitted with that new development. The water sources that we have are rivers and surface waters, which is default. We also have groundwater, and then reservoirs are being developed in CESM right now. So yeah, that's what you can't see on the bottom of this slide. So how well does CLM simulate crop yields? Like I said, this is not intended to be an agronomic model, so it's not, I don't expect it to be perfect. But this is global crop production. So this is grain production in terms of millions of tons through time. And so we always start simulations in the 1850s. CLM is in black. We don't have observational data back as early as 1850. And so from 1850 to 1950, we see a linear increase in crop yields through time. And then that increase starts to ramp up after the 1950s. So sort of, it's reasonably similar to FAO estimates of global grain yields, which is exciting for us because we didn't do much tuning of this model. But then when you start to reach the 1980s, 1990s, CLM crop yields level off, whereas FAO yields increase. And the reason that I think that there is this discrepancy is because CLM does not include any processes related to agricultural intensification, which really started to ramp up in the 80s and 90s. So there are things like changes in cultivars, changes in planting density, changes in technology that have all increased yields, continued this linear upward increase, where CLM does not include that, so yields stagnate over that time. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about the impacts of management on yields, which is what I will show you in a minute. But I wanted to highlight another pattern. So these are global maps. I have corn plotted here on the top and wheat on the bottom. These are just 2 of the crops that I chose to show you as an example. And then observations are here on the left, and the CLM simulations are here on the right. And part of the reason why I chose corn is because it highlights this really interesting pattern that we see in all crops, but is much more evident in corn. And it's that we underestimate yields in temperate ecosystems and overestimate yields in tropical regions. And I think part of the underestimation in temperate regions is really due to that lack of intensification. So we're not getting those new cultivars, those new planting densities. And so we're underestimating yields in a lot of these regions. We're overestimating yields in a lot of tropical regions. And I think that this is because we don't include the fact that pests, we have additional pest damage or potential extreme events that we can't mitigate in a lot of these regions. We don't have pesticides, herbicides, or insect outbreaks that really do affect these crops in tropical regions because oftentimes they're not managed as intensively as in some of the temperate regions. Okay, so how has, knowing that there are these caveats, how has management impacted crop yields? So what I'll show you is the management impacts on global grain production through time. And I guess I just want to start by saying that, I've never seen global estimates of the impact of management on crop yields. And so to me, this was a really exciting result and an exciting new feature of a model like the community land model that we could use to try and understand how management might impact agricultural yields. And so I'll start here by showing this green line. This is CLM5. It's the same as the black line in the previous figure that you saw. So you can see that there's this leveling out that means that we're underestimating yields for the end of the time series here. Next, I'll highlight that when we turn off irrigation, so when we do not irrigate crops, we get this decrease in yields that we see here. But even more impactful is this change in crop yields based on fertilizer. So fertilizer is having a larger impact than irrigation. Perhaps not surprising because fertilizer is more widely applied to agricultural regions than irrigation. There's actually a lot of rain-fed crops. Agriculture is about 10% of the land surface. And within that 10% of the land surface, only 20% of the crop areas are irrigated. So it's a small area. And this is actually quite a large impact on yields given that small area. But fertilizer is more widely applied. And so we see a much larger impact of fertilizer. Similar in size is the impact of cropland expansion. And I have to compare cropland expansion effect to a simulation without fertilizer and irrigation because when we don't allow crop area to expand, we're also not getting any irrigation or any fertilization on that crop area. So the crops are not seeing, so we wouldn't see cropland or fertilization or irrigation. And so that's the cropland expansion effect. We can also infer a bit of effect from climate change, including warmer temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations by looking at this simulation that held crop area constant at the beginning to the end. And you can see that impact of CO2 fertilization and temperature change is relatively small. Granted, this is not including irrigation or fertilization effects, and so it's potentially smaller. It's an inferred inferred change, but it's not nearly as large as the impact of cropland expansion or fertilization or irrigation. So climate change has increased crop yields a little bit, but not nearly as much as agricultural management. Okay, so that's a little bit about how we represent agriculture in CLM and also how agricultural management has changed crop yields through time. And so I'll just highlight that CLM is the first comprehensive representation of agriculture in an Earth system model. So this is a really exciting new development. CLM also simulates crop yields relatively well, but it doesn't include agricultural intensification or weed and pest management. So that results in an underestimation of crop yields in temperate regions and an overestimation of crop yields in tropical regions. And then last, global crop yields have increased most due to cropland expansion and industrial fertilization, but there is also a large impact of irrigation as well that is potentially going to be more important as climate continues to warm. Okay, so now I will switch into the last topic, which is how does agriculture change seasonal patterns of carbon dioxide fluxes? And what we'll find in this is that agricultural management is actually also a really important component of how agriculture influences these carbon dioxide fluxes. So I want to go back to this figure again and to thinking about the annual cycle of carbon dioxide, because this is what I'm going to be focusing on. And so remember that during the Northern Hemisphere growing season, we see a drawdown of carbon dioxide due to plant uptake of that carbon dioxide. And the change in the top and bottom, so the peak to trough change, is what I'm calling the seasonal amplitude. And the reason that I'm highlighting this is because the seasonal amplitude has increased through time. So this is a paper by Graven and colleagues that's showing the change in seasonal amplitude at 2 sites at Barrow, Alaska, and also at Mauna Loa. And what you'll notice is that amplitude is changing through time. So the growing season, there's more drawdown or more respiration that's changing that annual cycle. So what contributes to that changing carbon dioxide amplitude? Several things. There's been a lot of research on this topic. Enhanced seasonal carbon dioxide exchange is caused by increased productivity in northern ecosystems. So warmer temperatures is increasing plant productivity, potentially contributing to that drawdown. And part of that is, you saw the larger increase in amplitude in Barrow than you did at Mauna Loa. And so this is driving this, the results here. There's also carbon dioxide fertilization and land use change. That's contributing, as trees are growing more and more northern latitudes, we found that carbon dioxide and the higher carbon dioxide concentrations and also that northward movement of trees is contributing to the seasonal amplitude. And then there's some research that also shows that agriculture is an important part of the carbon dioxide amplitude. And that's important because most Earth system models are not actually capturing these trends in amplitude. And so you see the observations here. And then all of the Earth system models that were used in the coupled model intercomparison project version 5, which was run for the last IPCC report, that all of those models are underestimating that change in amplitude. So you see none of them are capturing this at all. And one of the reasons is because these models, none of these models included agriculture. But in the CMIP5, those older version of the CMIP models, is we used the Community Earth System Model 1, which had generic crop representation, where crops function similarly to C3 grasses. This is what all Earth System models were using in CMIP5, and CESM is the only Earth System model that now includes managed crops in the newer version, CMIP6, so the coupled model intercomparison project version 6. So in CESM2, as we just saw, crops are managed, they're planted, they're harvested, they're irrigated, they're fertilized. And this does have a large impact on terrestrial processes. I didn't show you that in the last section, but it does change fluxes of carbon, fluxes of water between the land and the atmosphere. And so if we look at trends in carbon dioxide amplitude in these two different versions of the model, they're improved in CESM2. So the observations are plotted here in black at all of these different sites. So I chose a latitudinal transect. Kumakahi and Mauna Loa are actually both in Hawaii, so they're both tropical sites. And then you have Niwot Ridge, which is in Colorado, and Barrow, which is in Alaska. And there's a few things that I want to point out. One is that the purple line is CESM2, and so that always has a higher amplitude than CESM1, which is shown in the orange line. And at Kumakahi and Barrow, the CESM matches these observations really, really well. Why are we still underestimated at Mauna Loa and Niwot Ridge? This is because these two sites are at much higher elevation. They're both around 14,000 feet. And what we found is that the vertical transport of carbon dioxide is still not modeled very well in CESM. And so you're not getting that vertical transport of carbon dioxide up. And we can see that by comparing Kumakahi and Mauna Loa, both of which fall in the same grid cell in the model. So both are using the same CO2 concentrations or the same site to look at the CO2 amplitude, but different atmosphere layers. So what you can see is the higher atmosphere layer has a much lower CO2 amplitude. So that's one reason why we're not matching at some of these higher sites. I did look at actually a total of 40 sites, and almost all of the sites look very similar, where observations match where the CESM2 simulations match the observations relatively well. So I wanted to know, could this improvement be in part due to agriculture? And what I found is that the answer is yes, and specifically agricultural fertilization. And so I will show you next the impact that agricultural nitrogen fertilization has on this carbon dioxide amplitude. So this is the change in carbon dioxide amplitude, so that change from peak to trough in the coupled community or system model. So this is you'll see in these agriculturally dominated regions, you're getting an increase in CO2 amplitude of about 9 parts per million, which is actually pretty large overall change in amplitude. So this is a simulation, a fully coupled simulation where I took agricultural fertilization and I just turned it off. And then I ran that simulation and compared it to a simulation that had agricultural fertilization turned on. You get a very similar amplitude, I should say, when you just simulate crops as generic crops in CESM2. You get a very similar change here. And so I'm showing you here in the land only model. So this is net biome production amplitude. Net biome production is the net flux of carbon from terrestrial ecosystems to the atmosphere. So it's actually the carbon cycle variable that is passed from the land surface into the atmosphere in this model. And so what you see is that you do see a large change in amplitude of net biome production, or NBP, in very similar regions. You see these large changes in CESM2, but the changes look less widespread. In some senses, you're not seeing some of the changes in the higher latitudes. It's actually a little hard to see on this screen, but there are blue areas that are changing, in the 1 to 3 amplitude throughout most of North America in these simulations that you don't get here in CLM5. And that's just because we don't have atmospheric transport in the land model when you're looking at land only simulations. But it's the NBP, or the net biome production, that is causing these changes in CO2 amplitude here in this top simulation. So I want to point this out because I'm going to use land only simulations next to think about how climate change, carbon dioxide, and other management practices might also change the amplitude of carbon dioxide. And so, like I said, I'm going to switch to land only model, and we're going to isolate the impact of fertilization and irrigation management in these models, or in this model, and also elevated carbon dioxide and climate. And so climate is just temperature and precipitation and other meteorological variables, but not the carbon dioxide. So those are separated. And like I said, we're going to be looking at net biome production, which is the net sea flux, the net carbon flux between the land and the atmosphere. So this plot is showing net biome production amplitude. The y-axis, I've started the plots in 1950 and run through 2015, which is when the model simulations ended. And I should also highlight that I'm only looking at the land area in the northern hemisphere above 30 degrees north, because that was the only region that was impacted by that's really the region that's driving the changes in amplitude. Okay, so here are the results. And what I'll start with first is this line, this purple line, CLM5. So this is the change in net biome production amplitude in CLM5. If you look at the impact of irrigation, that's the sort of yellowy orangey line. And you'll notice that without irrigation, you do see a small decrease in net biome production, but it's not very large. And similar to what I mentioned earlier in the talk, irrigated area is actually really small. And so when you do see the impact of irrigation, and I have maps that I've looked at, the impact of irrigation is on the same order of magnitude as the impact of fertilization. It's just isolated to a very small area. And I think that this is likely to become more important under future climate change as we expand the irrigated areas in response to warmer and drier conditions. Climate change also does have an impact. And so the difference between the purple line and this sort of reddish pink line, that's the impact of climate change. And so these are warmer temperatures. The impact is primarily in the northern latitudes. Elevated carbon dioxide concentrations also have an impact, and this impact is actually larger than the impact of the temperature and precipitation changes. And it really starts to become evident in the 1980s onward, that impact of CO2 on net biome production amplitude. So you are also seeing this impact of carbon dioxide in a lot of places globally. It's just it doesn't have as large of a magnitude in any of the locations as some of the other management factors. And so the last that I will show you is the impact of fertilizer. And fertilizer has a very large impact on net biome production. I believe this is almost a 50% change in net biome production amplitude. due to fertilization versus if you look at CO2, it's closer to a 40% change. And if you look at climate, it's only a 15 to 20% change in that biome production amplitude. So agricultural fertilization is changing those fluxes of carbon back to the atmosphere enough that we're seeing a change in the seasonal cycle of carbon dioxide. So that just really highlights how large of an impact agriculture has on our climate system. And if we really want to understand these climate carbon feedbacks that are driving climate change, we need to include agriculture. We need to consider that. Okay, so does agriculture change net CO2 fluxes? It does. The carbon dioxide amplitude increases more in CESM2, which includes the active representation of agriculture, than it does in CESM1. It also contributes to the increased seasonal amplitude, and this is primarily due to industrial nitrogen fertilization. And last, I do want to highlight that carbon dioxide and climate change have also contributed to that increasing amplitude, just not to the same magnitude as agricultural management. Okay, so now I'll just wrap up and I'll just leave you with some, I guess, key thoughts. How does human management of agriculture in terrestrial ecosystems change climate? So I showed you that crop production, in terms of crop production management, especially cropland expansion and fertilizer, increases crop yields. I also showed you that there are biogeophysical impacts that we also need to consider of agriculture. And so I highlighted an example using cover crops and thinking about how if we plant shorter or more sparse cover crops, you can minimize the effect of winter warming. And then last, I highlighted that agriculture, especially nitrogen fertilization, changes the seasonal carbon dioxide fluxes and the amplitude of that. And so really, in order to use these Earth system models to understand climate change, we need to include agriculture. Agriculture is really important for climate. It's important for changing energy, water, and carbon fluxes back to the atmosphere. And so we need to include these processes in these models and use these models to better understand how agriculture can influence climate. And that will help us figure out how to better think about agricultural management as a climate mitigation tool into the future. And so, I guess I doubled that slide. So I just want to end by really highlighting that models like the community land model and the community air system model can be used to answer exciting questions at both at site, regional, and also at global scales. And thinking about things like what resource limitations and challenges will we face in the future? How can management contribute to climate change? And how can management be used to mitigate or minimize the climate impacts while maintaining yields? So you can use a model like CESM and CLM to address these questions. We absolutely need to integrate observations and ecological theory in order to improve our understanding, to improve the representation of these processes. But we can use models as this useful tool to really understand what those climate impacts and interactions are. So I will just end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this exciting talk. I was wondering, does plant breeding, germplasms, herbicides, pesticides play a role anywhere? It didn't pop up. So either we need to abolish the plant breeding departments or it's somewhere in there. It's probably lumped in one of the other effects. And I was wondering, where are they? And does it make sense? Are there efforts to parcel this out, to figure this out? And the second question is, are you using, or do you want to use, or does anybody use AI in these endeavors, and where and how do you think there's an opportunity?
Right. Great questions. And so, yes, we do not need to abolish the plant breeding department.
Oh, you could say that.
But you know, I mean, genetics is a really important component. And I think that where that shows up is the fact that CLM does not capture or does not include anything related to plant breeding and changes in cultivar. And so we're missing that yield increase at the end of the 21st century, or the 20th century, sorry. And so we're not really seeing that large increase in part because we don't capture those processes. And so I think that we need to incorporate them. And in talking to Ying during my visit, I recently learned that she's actually working on some of those exact questions. Yeah. And so I'm excited to get to think about how we might be able to incorporate some of those processes into CLM. Related to AI and machine learning, we're not doing it yet, but I absolutely think it's going to be an important component. And this is actually what I mentioned to Ying yesterday. One example is in thinking about plant breeding and cultivar, how can we incorporate those changes through time? And we could use machine learning, for example, or we can consider using machine learning to think about how those things are changing through time, because we can't, in a global scale model, it's really hard to include all of the different cultivars and how they've changed through time. But if we could use some machine learning or AI applications to think about how those things have changed through time and to guide those representations, and maybe those are parameter changes. So the parameters are sort of the constant variables that affect different aspects of crop yields as represented in the model. And so if we could change some of those things to represent the changes in cultivars and changes in different aspects of plant growth, I think that that's one exciting application, one example that I can think of at the top of my head.
Tim?
I found your model predicting that cover crops would cause an increase in temperature in the vicinity of central Minnesota and Dakota, Saskatchewan. And I'm wondering whether your modeling is restricted to the above ground, above the snow temperature, or whether you also had modeling of the soil temperature. And my reason for asking is that for decades, we have been advising farmers to leave stubble over winter because it will catch snow, and the snow will provide an insulating layer. It will also prevent the snow from being, there's a lot of wind in this region. And so it holds the snow as opposed to having the snow drift away, leaving bare soil.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you took into account those factors.
Yes, these are all really fantastic questions, and those are processes that we are absolutely missing in the model. We don't have wind drifted snow. We don't include that. We do include soil temperatures, but the soil temperatures are not changing in response to root growth. It's another process that is just missing in the model. And so those are all things that we need to include and that I think will increase our confidence in these model simulations. And so that the cover crop temperature change, what I showed there is there's an increase in wintertime temperatures. I would not say this is absolutely what's going to happen because we know of all of these limitations. And also it was a very idealized scenario, and just looking at the above ground processes, we didn't change the soil temperature. And like I said, the soil temperature doesn't change in response to root growth, which I think is an important missing component. And as far as the physical processes of catching snow, I also recognize that that is a very important process, but no, we do not include that in the model. So those are things that I think need to be considered and will be important in future studies.
Dominic?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful talk. I wish I could ask you a dozen questions. Again, I'd like to look at agricultural application slides. I noticed a lot of your model runs are showing validation runs up to recent past. Of course, we want to use these models to peer into the future. And agriculture and climate are a coupled system. So you're looking at talking a lot about how agriculture affects climate, but we know that climate also affects what people do in agriculture.
Yes.
So, for example, planting and harvest dates, the growth, what crops you plant there, all of those things will change in response to a changing climate. Do you have any means of automatically trying to estimate what climate will do in different climate and getting that coupled feedback back into it?
So, I mean, great question. The short answer is no, we don't have that. And the way that we're trying to account for human decision changes is by running future scenarios. And those are using the different socioeconomic pathways. So they're more storylines, and those are developed for these future climate scenarios. They do include, what people think will happen in response to climate change in terms of that. But there aren't those coupled interactions. And this is I was actually just in the past year at a workshop that was talking exactly about this problem, because it's really, really hard to understand how human decisions are going to change. There's so many factors that go into it that it's really not easy to put into a large scale sort of physical Earth system model. It's such a challenge to try and understand how to predict. So there are prediction models that are trying to understand human interactions, reactions to climate change, but they're typically separated from these Earth system models, and trying to figure out how to better integrate those besides just taking data from one and passing it to another is a huge challenge. But it's something that I think would be great to think about. We are trying to start working with social scientists a little bit more. And so, for example, there's a current project at NCAR that is with a social scientist who is going and asking farmers questions about how they are dealing with, or how they're thinking about soil health and what influences their decisions. And in that way, we can try and better understand some of these interactions, but we're still not quite integrating human decisions into this kind of model, because most of the time we're just getting that from external integrated assessment models is what they're called, and pulling in the data from those models.
I have a question about the third project. I'm thinking about the international trade of products, because it's more and more intensified the international trade of products. The carbon can be uptaken from one place but released and transferred from another place. And thinking how much of the contribution comes from such international trade.
Yeah, it's another great question, and I think it very much can come from international trade, these changes in carbon fluxes, but we don't include that again in the model. So the way that the model currently works is all of the carbon that is in the grain is respired back to the atmosphere over the course of a year in the same location where it's harvested. And so we don't account for that. I think that we can. But it's another one of those sort of economic aspects where you need to know where that carbon is going, and how to think about incorporating a process like that into a model like this. It's another challenge. It doesn't mean that it's insurmountable. It just is another challenge. So yeah, we don't account for that at all. And we do have the atmospheric transport, but it is transporting the fluxes. And I think that that's also part of the reason why you're seeing the largest pulses or the largest changes in CO2 amplitude and also net biome production amplitude in the agriculture regions, because that's where the carbon is going.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.